All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Katie. I coordinate our University Express program, and we're joined with Anna VanDien for her presentation. That's going to be really informative and really helpful to us all today, so we appreciate her time. Some quick housekeeping. We are recording the session, and I'll try to post it on our website in the near future. Feel free to share it with any of your friends or family that you think might benefit from it, because it'll be on our website. If you have any questions for Anna, feel free to put those in our Q&A panel as she's going through her presentation. Nobody else can see them, it's just us, so we hope you get everything answered that you're looking for today. And quickly, we'll thank our sponsors, which is our Department of Senior Services, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And Senior Services is always here for you if you have questions about programs, supports, or services, or even if you're not sure where to start, give us a call. We're at 858-8526. All right. Anna is the coordinator of the Wilson Support Center. The Wilson Support Center provides grief support and education that is sensitive, compassionate, and responsive to the needs of the Western New York community. Information and resources are available to any individual experiencing grief and loss, and she's going to talk about that a lot, I'm sure, today. So Anna, thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to spend some time with you. I, of course, wish it was in person, but here we are together in some way. All right. All right. Everything looking good, Katie? Or do I need to swap?
Swap it, and now we're good.
Okay, great. All right. So today we're talking about caring for grieving children. And as uncomfortable as grief can be to talk about, I think children who are grieving can be even more uncomfortable to experience. You know, we have our own discomfort with death and with grief, but to see an upset child really hits like the hardwiring of our brains and our emotional being. So we're going to walk through a little bit of what you can do to take care of yourself and to take care of a child. I am going to walk through the different age groups of children, just because once you get to the teen years, it changes a little bit. And I like to highlight infants because I feel like often they're a little overlooked. So we'll talk about how to help and what to understand about their experience. And then also to talk about when to get additional help, because that's often a question that I hear. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the significance of rituals. That's something that at the Wilson Support Center, we really like to cover when it comes to grief because they can be so significant. And finally, I'll run through some resources before I get to your questions. So we are recording this, which I think is great. You can go back and look at those resources a little bit more in depth. A lot of them are books because books are a great way to really connect with kids and help them make sense of their emotions. So the Wilson Support Center is located on the Hospice Buffalo campus in Cheektowaga. We are probably best known for that affiliation through the Hospice Bereavement service, but our information and resource, guidance, telephone support, all of that is available to the greater Western New York community. So this is our building. Unfortunately, it's been pretty quiet during COVID. We still are all working remotely. This is my one day in the office. So it's hopefully one day we can have that grand reopening and hopefully that day will be sooner than later. This is all of our contact information. I will share it again at the end of the presentation, but if you need anything, that's our main number. And that is our main email as well. So someone will get in touch with you if you send a message that way. A brief highlight of what these supports and services look like. Generally, we have support groups available to the community and a number of support groups that are focused on different types of loss. There's an asterisk next to that because they are paused right now. We remain available for resource referral, counselor referrals, especially within your health insurance plan. You can kind of tailor that to what you need. We have had youth programs in the past, and there are some aspects of those that we are offering virtually at different times of the year. We have a lot of educational materials that are always available with your call. And we can, of course, link you to anything else in the community that might be pertinent to your circumstance. And of course, trainings and in-services, educational presentations like this. Within that hospice bereavement service, I just like to kind of call out what's included there too, because our hospice community is within the greater Western New York community as well. And so if you have lost someone through hospice, or if someone you know has had someone die under hospice care, these are services that are available to them for 13 months after the death. So individual counseling is still available remotely. We have support groups that are also virtual. And the two things that have been paused are the mass mailings that we make. We still do individual mailings, but those mass mailings have been paused, and of course, our events. There will be a time of remembrance for the community in the winter, a winter solstice time of remembrance. So keep an eye out for some information on that next month. All right, so if you have heard me speak before, this might feel like a little bit of review, but I just feel like we need to all start on this understanding of what grief is and what it's not. So grief is not a disorder. It is a completely natural response to the loss of something significant. The way we respond to grief is very individual between people. We may respond more or less emotionally. We may respond more or less physically. People are often surprised that they have physical symptoms of grief. And of course, our spirituality can change, ebb and flow. We have questions. That connection looks different. So all of that is included in a grief response. As Earl Grolman says, the price you paid for love. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. So let's just start from an understanding that there's nothing wrong with you for feeling grief, for experiencing that, that loss and all of the symptoms that come from that. I like to explain some of this based off of the idea of attachments, because that is essentially what we are grieving, is the loss of attachment. Sometimes that's through death, sometimes it's through prolonged physical distance, which some of us may be feeling these days. But I like this picture because I think that it really demonstrates the way that we have different attachments. So you have a parent here holding a child and the child holding a doll. And the idea that that child is attached to that doll. And of course, the parent is attached to the child as well, and the child is attached to the parent. So you have all of these simultaneous attachments, and if either one of them was broken, there would be an emotional, physical, spiritual response, okay? Because these things are significant in our lives. It's very human and natural to form these attachments. We are hardwired to find people and to form these attachments and love them. And thus, grief is also very natural and, in fact, expected throughout life. So let's talk about why specifically children and the topic of grief is important. Grief is something that can last a lifetime. When someone you love dies, that grief can last forever. But the pain within that grief doesn't have to. So that idea that the separation will continue, but that emotional reactivity doesn't need to. Eventually, we are able to adjust through healthy grief. Grief becomes integrated into life, and through different rituals or continued connection, we're able to really understand grief as just part of our life. So the importance of talking about grief with children is that if they lose someone significant in their early life, they will continue to understand that grief different. It will continue to evolve. They will continue to have questions throughout their life and understand how their life was different without that person present, the way that maybe other children's lives are different from their own because they had that person present. So these early experiences of children can really inform them of grief, as well as understanding death, understanding how to cope with stressful times, understanding how to identify and express their emotions. So there's a lot wrapped up in those early experiences of grief. And one of the major reasons why I think a lot of us in the grief world have an acute lens on a child that is going through the death of a loved one. Many people, I often hear many people say things like, you know, our baby is so young, they don't understand what's going on. They don't know what's going on. And they may not understand the full significance of that event, but they do miss the familiar presence. Okay, they're already attaching, even as a young infant, they're already forming attachments, especially with parents, perhaps with grandparents who are helping with caregiving, with siblings. So they're going to miss any familiar presence that's no longer there. They're also going to be able to sense any emotions around them, especially emotions that are specifically profound. You know, they're little sponges that are just grabbing onto everything. And I don't have to tell you all, because I know you've all had those experiences with young ones and especially infants, but they're going to really soak in what's been going on around them. And it can be confusing to them because they don't have kind of the brain structure to start making sense of it. And so they may act out in a different way through more crying, different patterns. Speaking of patterns, they're going to notice any changes in routine. So there's a lot of effort around those young ones to make sure that any routine that can be kept is still honored. Really, the salve to all of this is to offer just extra cuddles, extra love, give them that support and attention that they need and the reassurance. A lot of people will try to avoid having like those more emotional conversations in front of an infant, just to try to help with some of the reactivity that the baby may feel. Within children, and we're probably talking 3 to 8 here, even up to 12. Although, of course, all of that is very loose. There's a lot of common grief responses. And a lot of this is them trying to make sense of something that they can't make sense of, right? And they may not have, again, that brain development to make sense of it, depending on their age and their developmental stage. But a lot of children have a sense of panic. So they wonder if, because that person died, they will die too. They have a lot of anger, feeling like the person that died maybe chose to leave, deserted them. They feel abandoned. Or they may be mad at the doctor because the doctor was supposed to take care of them. There's a lot of bodily distress. So children, and you'll hear me say this a couple times probably, children really respond to things through play, through physicality. And so seeing a body response, a physical response is very common. So that could be trouble sleeping. It could be losing appetite. It could be wetting their pants if maybe they haven't done that. And they otherwise, you know, were potty trained. So all of those kind of changes to body distress would be normal. We'll just keep an eye on the duration because that's where we would start to be concerned. A lot of guilt, and that's heartbreaking, but I think guilt is something that even as adults we often feel in our grief. So it totally makes sense that, of course, children who are grappling with understanding this would also sense this guilt. They may feel like they caused the death even. And we'll talk about magical thinking, but that's kind of the idea that they caused this somehow. Withdrawal, so the idea of withdrawing from the loved ones that they have that are still alive for fear of losing them and feeling this pain again. Again, another response that a lot of adults have as well. Replacement, the idea that you are going to make this fast play to substitute someone for the person that died. Assuming mannerisms, so starting to speak or act the way that the person who died would act or speak. when we get into the topic of talking about death with children, it's really emotionally difficult. I think it's, again, a challenge to our own discomfort with talking about death and talking about grief. But I think a lot of people feel like they could misstep very easily. And so I put these 4 concepts up because I think that it helps to really use clear language and concrete language. So the first major concept is that the child needs to understand that death is irreversible. It is permanent. And with younger kids, that is harder to understand. And it's going to take some time for them to really fully realize what that means. They may ask a lot of follow-up questions or even repetitive questions, and that's okay. That's just them like making sure that they're starting to grasp this. The other part of permanency, this irreversibility, is that that person who died can't choose to come back. Okay, so that goes back to this fear that maybe they chose to leave. It wasn't their choice, and they can't choose to come back. The second major concept is that all life functions end completely at the time of death. So sometimes kids will worry that maybe that person is feeling cold or hungry. It's really important for them to understand that none of that is active anymore in that body. A lot of people will use the comparison to sleep. And that's really something that you want to avoid because sleeping is not the same as death. And you may think that kids can kind of understand what that difference is, but they can't. We need to be really clear about it and use words like death. The third one is that every living thing dies. So this really avoids the guilt and the shame that can sometimes come from this experience of death. The idea that everyone, and every pet, every plant, perhaps, every living thing will die. I recently talked to someone who had a kid think that they equated the person to a phone. The way we say, "Oh, my phone is dead," they thought that maybe there was some way to like charge the person that they lost. And so I think that's a good example of just like how even when we think we're being clear, kids' brains are like trying to find a way, right? Because of course they're trying to avoid this awful reality that we already know. So just explaining that every living thing dies. There's nothing that this child could have done to cause the death. There's nothing that this child could have done to reverse the death. And finally, the fourth concept, there are physical reasons that someone dies. So again, it just creates that clearer expectation and explanation that there wasn't any wish that you put out there in the world that could have caused this. There was physical reasons for the death. These are just some examples of some of the unclear communication we hear sometimes, and I'm going to explain what's problematic in some of these situations. So the first one, Jesus took her to be with him in heaven. That can cause a lot of fear if the child believes that people can just be snatched at any time. I think that there's probably a better way, if that's your belief, that there's an easier and more clear way to explain that. Daddy was so good that God, I'm sorry, that's an awful word sentence. Daddy was so good that God had to have him with him. Now the kid might be afraid of being good, right? Because this consequence was not good. Auntie has gone to sleep. So we talked about that. Not only is that just unclear as to what sleep is and what death is, but the child might then be fearful of falling asleep, or maybe fearful of someone else they love falling asleep. Mommy went on a long trip. That feels like abandonment for kids. And death is darkness and nothingness. Even if that's what you believe, that's something that to the child may mean their room when all the lights are off. and you don't want them to be afraid of the dark, especially when that's a nightly occurrence where you need to be in the dark and sleep. So those are just some examples. There's, of course, a lot of other ones too, but those are a lot that we hear commonly. So that's just to be clear, those are no-nos. So I mentioned the idea of magical thinking, and I wanted specifically to bring this up because it's very common with children, especially in the age of like 5 to 7 or 8. They have this belief that their negative thoughts or wishes contributed to the reason why someone died. So it could be something like the sister gets mad at her brother and wishes that he would just leave her alone, and then he gets sick and has to go to the hospital. In her mind, she's starting to link these things, and she thinks that she's the cause, she's guilty for this. And it may seem illogical to us, but it's not in her brain. Again, her brain is developing still and making sense of all of these causations, the cause and effect. So it's really important to just reiterate that that death was not their fault, and that the death is not something that they could have prevented. The other kind of sticky point with magical thinking is that the kids don't always share that they are feeling this way, right? We don't know that they had this wish, or that maybe even they verbalized it, but we weren't there. So they may harbor this for a while. And I've heard of some of our clinicians uncovering some of this in their work with adults, exploring prior losses and prior deaths in their life, and discovering that they've still held on to guilt even as an adult, because it was formed way back in their childhood. So again, just showing how important it is to really give opportunities to talk about their feelings and to express what they are feeling. Whenever we have the death of someone that we love, no matter our culture, there's usually an expectation of some sort of ceremony. So whether that's a funeral, a burial, whatever your cultural tradition celebrates or practices, these are just some considerations for those young ones. It's always helpful to give some expectations of what will be taking place during these events, really answering as many questions as you can, sharing as many details as possible. I always encourage people to let the child decide whether they want to attend or not. We find that there's a lot of room for resentment in these situations. And so if they are not given the opportunity to attend and they stay home, perhaps again, when they're processing this grief later in life, they feel like they didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye. They didn't get to see what that person looked like, perhaps if they are in a casket, or even just understanding what your culture does when someone dies is important. Finding a buddy to be with the child can be really helpful. That way, if that child wants to leave and take a break, there's someone who can do that. Kids usually can't tolerate stress or high emotional moments for too long, the same way that adults have kind of a longer attention span. It's the same that kids have a much shorter ability to tolerate those things. So if they're getting overwhelmed, it might be nice to have a buddy to take off with them. You can offer participation in the service depending on your cultural traditions. Again, leave that up to the child. And then you can offer other options too. So maybe there's another place, a friend's house that you can drop the kid off if they don't want to go to the service, or if they just want to be near the family, but they don't really want to be in there. Maybe there's areas for them to play or be otherwise. When we get into the topic of adolescents and teens, things start to change a little bit. That brain is developing, the attachments are different. Teenage years are also full of other more minor losses, I would say. So this idea that as you're approaching adolescence and your teen years, you're becoming less of a child, you're kind of losing that childhood and some of the things we associate with that. You're gaining independence, but that can be scary, even though it's exciting. You're kind of starting to redefine your relationship and your boundaries with your parents. So there's a lot of navigation within those teen years that can be really difficult anyway, that naturally start to form some isolation, and it could be healthy isolation. It's just that idea of having some time to yourself, some space for yourself. And that's totally natural. When you couple that with an experience of grief, especially if it's their first major death, they can really become more susceptible to stress. And because that piece of isolation is already starting to form, where they go to their friends instead of going to their parents, maybe for support, it can be easy to kind of assume that they're being supported. But in fact, what we find is that they kind of self-isolate. So they may be going to their friends for some support, but they may not be asking the questions that they have. And because they've gone historically to their friends, now do they still go to their parents for the support? So it can just be a tricky time depending on what's going on in their life. There are also, this is a prime example of how that increase of independence can make them more susceptible to unhealthy coping strategies. So they have more access maybe to things that aren't going to be good, healthy patterns to bring with them into adulthood as they experience more grief. So teens really need to be openly embraced as part of the family's experience of that loss and of their collective grief. Sometimes parents will try to protect the teen by avoiding the subject. But again, check in with them just the way that you would check in with a child. See if there's anything else. Yeah, so you want to also incorporate teens just as you would a child into that ritual planning. So a funeral or a burial, a memorial service. If one is planned, it can be really beneficial and meaningful for that teen to use their strengths and their skills, their talents, to express their love for the person that they have lost. Teens can be difficult as far as offering that physical support and that physical nurturing. Again, with them not wanting to be a child anymore, but still secretly maybe wanting that love as a child, right? It's what we suggest is that you at least ask, this is a hard time. Would you like a hug? It may not feel right, depending on your relationship with the child, it may not feel right to just go in for a hug. But you can always offer and always ask, because they're still people. They still need that human reassurance. Contact those supports at school. So teens are spending a lot of time, well, a majority of their time really at school. The caveat, of course, is if virtual is their choice right now. But those are the people that are going to have eyes on them. They're going to notice any change in behavior probably more acutely. And any concerns about grades and projects. There's also that added benefit of having just a little bit more understanding and maybe leniency around their circumstance. So it's good for school to be aware, and it's good for teens to know that there are supports, whether it's a teacher that they get along with or their guidance counselor if you have a social worker, that those are points of support. Sometimes teens don't feel comfortable talking to their friends. They don't feel comfortable talking to their parents or their grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever it might be. But they feel like that little bit of distance they have between their teacher or guidance counselor is enough for them to really open up. Really attend to that search that you see within them for belonging. So sometimes, because they're seeking support, but they don't know how to go about that anymore. They can't just run up and give mom a hug anymore. They can, but usually they don't. And they may not feel vulnerable enough to speak openly with their friends. So sometimes we see teens really fall into romantic relationships quite quickly because they're seeking that belonging, and that's really a fast way of finding belonging and acceptance. So we just want to be careful that that's really a healthy relationship and a relationship that is truly supportive and one that is giving them the kind of belonging, the sense of belonging that is genuine. Identify those healthy coping strategies with the team. So even as adults, we find quick fixes, and that's just fine. It helps us in the moment. It's usually required on our day-to-day. We don't always have time to just put things aside and get down to our emotions. But we want to be, of course, careful about quick fixes for teens that might look more like drugs and alcohol. Just like adults, we have to be careful about those things. So that temporary escape might see through a substance might seem even more attractive now, and they may have an increased access to it as well. So again, just things to be in mind, keep in mind. Right, so how can we do anything in these situations? I know it's cliche, but really, truly, the first thing to do, regardless of who you're supporting, is to take care of yourself. This is even more significant when it's a child or a teen, because you are modeling for them. And so much is reflected in how you carry yourself and take care of yourself. They're going to pick up on those things. So by even crying openly and sharing your emotions is going to demonstrate to them the way you express emotions and speak about them in a healthy, productive way. The other thing is coping strategies. So even sharing, you may not be crying openly in that moment, but you may share with them, I feel guilty sometimes too. I know it's not my fault, and sometimes it's hard to push that feeling aside. These are the ways that I deal with it. That can be helpful. Maintaining structure. So not only for yourself, but for those children and teens, goes back to that idea of a routine. It's just really even more significant for children as they're growing. Prepare them for those anticipated events, set their expectations, just share those clear basic facts so that they can anticipate appropriately what's about to happen. It makes things a little less scary. Encourage that emotional expression. So oftentimes children won't actually come to us about it. We need to sit down with them and just check in, ask them how they've been doing, ask about the person that has died, ask if they have any questions. Repeat that, repeat it, because slowly they're going to understand that you do care about any questions they have. They do care, we do care about, supporting them. And it gets less and less scary the more that we check in, and it also normalizes that maybe they do have questions. It normalizes that maybe they are feeling some sort of way. So all of that is just, it brings down those walls and makes it easier for them to share. Along with that, normalizing the emotions. I think it goes hand in hand with checking in with them. Whatever they share, explain that I understand that, you felt that way too, or you felt that way in the past, and explain, maybe give them some understanding of maybe why they feel that way if they can't make sense of it. So listen to their fears. What this means is don't force them into any situation. So we talked about that memorial service example. If the child really does not want to go, do not force them. And if they really don't want to stay home and they want to be there, don't force them to stay home. It's really important that they feel like they have some sort of agency in this time, because the overwhelming feeling is a loss of control. Anytime we lose someone, it feels like we don't have control over that. And by being able to say, yes, I want to show up for that and say goodbye to them, it means a lot for that to be honored. I've already said this, but I'll say it again. Welcome the questions and answer them simply. So again, invite the kid to share what they've been thinking about. Try to detect any misconceptions that you may hear them speak about. Again, that idea that they spoke this thing into existence. They had hoped their brother would leave and then he did. I have a question here that was an example someone shared with me. A grandson said, I know daddy died, but do you think he'll be able to come to my birthday party? So it's another example that this child understands that dad died, but he's still trying to understand the permanency of that and the fact that dad can't just die and then come back for special days. So it's going to take that repetition to really understand. Expand the support. So seek out support from other people in the child's life. It could be at school, it could be a faith community. It may just be your own peers who have been part of their life. It could be their friends. So look for ways to really wrap that support around them. And then give that extra love and comfort. We mentioned that for infants, but it's really no different for an older child too. We want to make sure to seek additional professional support when we see some of these red flags. Even with very attentive loved ones, some children do benefit from professional counseling, and sometimes even through like a creative art therapist. I mentioned that kids really express themselves physically, and so sometimes that's through play, and sometimes it's through art. But having those physical mediums to really make sense of their emotions and identify them can be a way to kind of unlock what's going on in their mind. And to that end, sometimes what I'll see is a child who has been really emotionally activated. They become really upset for a little bit, and then all of a sudden they turn on a dime and they just go and run around the playground and go and play with their friends as if nothing had happened. And to an adult, that feels like whiplash, you know, and a lot of people worry that that's a sign that they need some additional help. But actually, it's very healthy. And that's an expected part of the child's process because of that shortened attention span, right? They can't hold on to those scary, immense emotions for as long as an adult. And that's another reason why some of these more creative art therapies or play therapies are even more advantageous, because an 8-year-old is not going to sit through an hour psychotherapy session the same way that an adult can. And an adult may really need that hour to like really get into it and grapple with the intricacies of that death. But a kid is going to deal with that much different. So it's okay if that's what you see. What we're concerned about are some of these red flags. So the idea that they're not interested in the future, they're just very negative thinking. If their school performance starts to decrease, or even their engagement with school starts to decrease, you may notice increased alone time. And I should say that any of these signs could be present in the immediacy after a death. What we're concerned about is when these signs have been present for a prolonged amount of time and they're present for most of the time. So physical complaints, we talked a little bit about that, but this would be even more like internalized, like headaches and stomach aches all the time. Disinterest in life, or the idea of feeling numb. Sleep disturbances or nightmares. Temper tantrums that are very frequent and prolonged. We want to normalize anger as a part of grief, even for kids. But a temper tantrum frequently and for a long time is, if that didn't happen before the death, then that might be a red flag. Excessive crying, that inability to self-soothe. Eventually the child should be able to use its coping mechanisms and maybe support from a loved one to feel okay and to end that crying session after they've expressed their emotions. But if it's just happening all the time, you know, poor thing, we need to get that child more support. And finally, separation anxiety. So again, a very natural part in those immediate days of grief. But if this is all the time and really interfering with daily life, there's that heightened concern of safety for a loved one when the child isn't with them. And that's not sustainable, and that's something that you likely need professional support to address. What you'll notice with a lot of these is that it could depend on their development stage as well. And that's, of course, a consideration. Anytime you see anytime you see a child that's regressing to kind of an earlier developmental stage, that's also going to be a concern if it's continued for quite a while. Right, so we talked a little bit about our standard rituals through funerals, burials, services of that nature. What I'm going to talk about here is the significance of something a little bit more private. And it's something that actually people have done naturally throughout time, like centuries. But specifically in the past couple of years with COVID, as it's become more difficult to gather in person as a collective group, I've seen a lot of people focus more on this personal ritual. And what's interesting is that there are actually studies that show that engaging in these private rituals can actually help to ease the pain and the burden of grief, because it helps you to maintain some connection to that person that has died. So in the idea of helping children, I think that this is really important for them to kind of have that ownership over their special relationship with that person who died, and to explore ways to continue to connect. So this is just a helpful guide to kind of talk through and consider what a ritual might look like for a child. So choosing a time and a date, that could be really formal, like every year on that person's birthday. Or it could be, every Sunday evening, this is what we do to get ready for our week. But it's that idea of setting time aside specifically for that purpose, and anyone who's involved in the ritual knows. So you're going to consider, brainstorm with the child what that actual specific and meaningful action would be to honor that relationship with the person. And the key here is really to keep it personal. So what is the thing that, this child loved to do with that person? I know there's a daughter I have in mind who lost her mother, and the two of them loved ice cream. And so that's always something special that she can do when she's feeling specifically disconnected from mom. It helps to bring up some memories. And that idea that you start to lose memories can be really discouraging and really scary. But by re-engaging in an activity that the child used to do with that person can help to bring some of those memories back and reinforce that connection. So I'm going to just highlight these online resources. I'm just looking, many of them are specifically focused on children. So the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, the Child Mind Institute, the Dougie Center, all of those are heavily focused on children. Even the New York Life Foundation, over the past 2 years, they've put out this series of books that you can access as a PDF on their website for free. And it talks through the different kind of stages of this young boy's loss of his father, and the way that it impacts his mother as well. But it's their children's books. So there's a lot of other initiatives through the New York Life Foundation that really supports grief and loss education and support. But also the Center for Loss and Life Transition is absolutely wonderful, really regardless of the loss or death that has occurred, as well as What's Your Grief. That one's a little bit more contemporary, but it's, again, a lot of resources with all sorts of different focuses. So I'm just going to run through some quick book recommendations. Again, you can access this recording to review. I'm starting with some books for the younger children. So this first one, I Miss You, A First Look at Death. Very straightforward with practical explanations. They do discuss funerals and other expectations around what happens when someone dies. Sad Isn't Bad is actually a guidebook. It's like a workbook for kids, and it helps them to recognize their emotions and explore how they can express those emotions in a healthy way. The Invisible String and Ida Always are both about continuing bonds, continuing connections to the loved one. Both explore serious illness and end-of-life decline. The Fall of Freddie the Leaf is kind of a classic. It's been around for a long time. And it uses a character that is a leaf to kind of create an allegory of the passage of time within life, and that then death is natural, a natural cycle of life, as is grief and bereavement. And so it goes as a more abstract observation on life and the mysteries that are part of life. So where do we come from and where are we going? It just gives permission to feel that full spectrum of emotion. These are the New York Life Foundation books that I mentioned. So Kai is the main character. And so it goes through, The Golden Sweater is the primary book that talks about that loss of his father. And then there's two other ones that they've formed. The Girl with the Locket is where he connects with another girl who's lost someone at a camp. And then The Fishless Lake is actually about those fading memories, and mom brings Kai out to go fishing to help bring some of those memories back. So that is where I'm going to leave you today. It's a lot of information. I welcome any questions that you have. Please know if you feel more comfortable reaching out to us on an individual basis. We always welcome that. And sometimes it can be more helpful because we can get into the individual circumstances and really provide some guidance and specific supports and resources to you that way.
All right, Anna, thank you so much for that presentation and all of that wonderful information and walking us through that journey. I'm seeing one question at the moment, so I'll read that. Is there a good way to start preparing young children for a death, maybe from cancer?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we know that death is imminent, it's decline is occurring, it's good to start those conversations as early as possible. So, and again, when we talk about sharing expectations of what a memorial service is going to look like, I would apply the same guidance at this point, at this juncture. So the idea that you're going to share expectations of how this person, how the person with, we'll say cancer, since you brought that up, the person with cancer, like what to expect, what they're going to look like, how much more they'll be sleeping, how much they'll be able to interact. And along with that, so preparing for those things, along with that, also highlighting the amount of support around that child as well. Explaining that it's okay to feel scared. It's okay not to know. There's a lot we don't know right now. I'm going to come to you anytime I do find something out, and I'm going to let you know. And to make sure also that any of that information is age appropriate or developmentally appropriate. So, we don't want to talk over an 8-year-old's head. We want to try to reduce it down to really what is what's the point? What is the message we're trying to share with that child? Specifically with cancer, I can speak to the involvement often of a child life specialist. And really, anytime you're in like a hospital setting, they'll have that resource available. Usually they are brought into the team once they realize that there are children that will be impacted by this death. So if that is someone that is not yet on the care team, I would ask about it. And if they're not available, there are a lot of resources online. So I'll explain what this role is because it might be new. The idea of a child life specialist is that they're really able to reduce all of this information into clear language. And so I've seen resources online where they really, especially when you're talking about traumatic deaths, imagine telling a child, and unfortunately maybe some of you have been in this situation, where you explain to a child that someone has died by suicide, that someone has died by an overdose. Those can be really complicated deaths, wrought with all sorts of emotions, and you really want to get it right, but you don't always know. So I really like the idea of seeking out those child life specialist resources, because they can really skillfully outline exactly what is appropriate for that developmental stage, and what needs to be shared at that moment. But start those conversations when you know.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Just seeing one more question here that came through. What are your thoughts about talking about a deceased person's spirit still being around?
That's going to look different depending on anyone's spiritual belief, faith tradition. That's kind of, I mean, it is close to what the idea of continuing bonds is, the idea of that continued connection. So if you think about, if you think of it as spirit, you know, I think that can be something that is very, very meaningful, very healing for a lot of people. Sometimes we also talk about it as far as connection to someone's history, connection to someone's memories. You know, that can also take on a very similar aspect. So yeah, I think, you know, just understanding what that belief is so that the child understands exactly what it is that you're saying. But you know, there's a great way to do that, and I think it really can be beneficial. Again, depending on your family's discussion and beliefs.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I'm not seeing anything else come through, so we can just give it a second. Is there anything else you want to leave us with, Anna?
I think I just want to really thank all of you. Like I said before, it can be hard to, and even activating sometimes, to sit and listen to something like this. It can be pretty heavy, especially if you have someone or something on your heart. So I really appreciate you all attending and watching and engaging. If there's anything that bubbles up, you know, in the days and weeks to follow, please reach out. Even if it's just you don't know what you need, but maybe you just need to get it off your chest. You never know what ideas we might have, and you never know who might else be going through this. You know, there could be a whole resource there that could be helpful. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out and just check in.
All right, that's definitely important. So with that being said, we'll end here. Anna, thanks for your time. Everyone who's on, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thanks, Katie.